Good morning. Well, thank you very much, Wim, for this introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me here. And Wim and I have come across each other for some time, so the last 10 years, so various fora about investment and growth issues and building resilience to shocks. And he's an excellent researcher. I'm very excited to talk here today at this conference. So thank you very much. I was also excited because because of the topic of the conference, and the topic of the conference is in part about responding to resource scarcity, and that is an issue that we've been working on over the last year or so as part of the preparation for the European Report on Development 2011 and 2012. The European Report on Development is a report that is commissioned by the European Commission and 7 EU member states, and it helps to inform their policies, building on the best of European and developing country research. Now, this is the first time that ODI has taken the lead on the European Report on Development. This is the 3rd edition, and we're doing this together with 2 other organizations in Europe, the ECDPM here in Maastricht as well, and the German Development Institute in Bonn. And we've had already a number of consultations over the last few months in various European cities, but also in developing countries, and we've been engaged in commissioning a number of research papers as well. And we've had discussions including business, NGOs, and researchers. The topic of this upcoming report on development is effective net resource management for inclusive and sustainable growth in the context of increased scarcity and climate change. What role for the public and the private sector? And I mean, that's a lot of terms in there, and we've been discussing all of these terms during the consultations. And what I will be talking today about is some emerging issues that have come to the forefront. So basically, in the coming sort of 25 minutes, I'll be talking about sort of what is the message, particularly what is the new context for net resource management. And I was very interested to hear the previous speaker on this already, that we're living in a very different world, or expected to be living in a very different world soon. We then add to this some increasing complexities about sort of the world that we're living in, which is the resource nexus, that resources are increasingly interrelated. We then think a bit about a framework to tackle some of the challenges that these new problems face, and then we think about how to promote inclusive and sustainable growth in the new context, and then we focus a bit on roles of the public and the private sector, and what are the solutions that the public sector has to offer, what are the solutions that the private sector has to offer. And if there's time, I also will spend some time about sort of what are possible implications for the EU to help developing countries manage the new pressures on their resources. What we're saying is that there are a set of upcoming environmental pressures, global environmental pressures, that are threatening to undermine development prospects in developing countries, and also the poorest people within countries. And that means that we need to act. We need to do something, because it has a cost if we don't act. And we're saying that the international community urgently needs to recognize this and address the issues in an integrated way, and in particular focused on finding solutions for managing energy, water, and land. And we focus on water, energy, and land, and we call it the well nexus: water, energy, and land. So the world needs to find solutions to the increasing pressures in these 3 resources, and that requires joint action. Joint action by a range of actors. So it's governments, of course, but also business, international organizations, and civil society organizations as well. So I'll be talking a little bit about the new trends in natural resource management. And some of you may be well aware, but due to rising incomes, the rise of middle class groups, the rise of the emerging powers, productivity changes, as well as population increases, there will be increasingly pressures on our resources, and in particular, demand for food is expected to rise by about 50% in 2030. Demand for energy is expected to rise by about 40% until then, and the demand for water as well. And this has led some to suggest that we're entering in a sort of resource crunch. Temperatures are increasing, and planetary boundaries are near tipping points. Now, what does it mean for development is one of the questions that we pose later. Some of these charts, if you look at natural resource use, they're all really trending upwards, accelerating in the last sort of 50 years. And it's really scary sometimes. You think that it's really going up, all the natural resources that are being used. And of course, I mean, GDP increases are fine as such, but the problem is that that natural resource use has also grown very fast, and there hasn't been sort of an absolute decoupling, which would mean that the growth, economic growth, is going up, whereas the pressures on natural resources are declining. There's been some relative decoupling due to efficiency increasing. Now, Rockstrom and his co-authors have coined the term planetary boundaries, and they came up with a set of 9 planetary boundaries within which the planet can operate safely. If you transgress them, then it's unlikely that we can operate safely, and that will then the world might transgress into sort of transgress tipping points, and that will then have major implications. And of these 9 planetary boundaries, the authors suggest that already for 3 we have transgressed these planetary boundaries. That's a complex world, but actually we're adding one more complexity to this, and that is what we call the well nexus, the nexus between water, energy, and land. And that is basically to say that these resources are increasingly related, and we've been discussing this nexus in various consultations, and you can think about various activities here that illustrate the nexus. Biofuels is an interesting example. So biofuels is very often seen as a solution for reducing greenhouse emissions, and certain technology will indeed do so, will help to do that. But there are of course pressures on other resources, because biofuels actually needs a lot of land to grow on, and that will might display other uses of that land, and it also needs water. Now, there are a number of other activities that you can think about. If you think about new solutions to problems, then actually these new solutions might create other problems as well, because they depend on other resources. And that is, for some people, actually nothing new. They say, well, yeah, of course, everything is related to everything else. And in economics, we know about these input-output tables. Of course, the factors are related and so on. But I think there are 3 new issues that we need to consider, at least, and to say that this well nexus is very important to be thinking about. And this in part because we're moving into a world of moving towards absolute scarcity as well. Because some of the resources are actually beginning to be absolutely scarce. Of course, relative scarcity is a concept. Absolute scarcity is a concept. But for some, we might be running out. And if that's the case, then of course, and if resources are increasingly interrelated, then the availability of one particular resource might be a binding constraint on the development of another resource, or using the other resource. Secondly, resources are increasingly interrelated. So the production of energy requires a lot of water. the irrigation requires a lot of energy, and increasingly so. So you find that that sort of the input-output coefficients, as it were, are increasing. And this means that the externalities of using one resource or doing being engaged in one activity are increasing. That makes it also more important to be thinking about the interrelationships and solving coordination failures. And finally, I think within this nexus, it's also important to say that within the traditional input-output models, you could solve this system of equation because you knew the prices and so on, and the price of labor, price of capital, then is very easy. But the price of land is already very difficult. The price of water is very difficult. What is the price of water, particularly in a developing country context? And very often it's not priced, although the use has an environmental consequence. And of course, the price of energy, or where we think about it, carbon space, is not really factored in. Just to some illustrations to illustrate the concept of the well nexus and the interrelationships. Some of you may be aware of the fact that about 1 in 3 roses in the EU market comes from Kenya. And in particular goes to the UK and Netherlands, of course. And most of these roses are grown around Lake Naivasha in the Lake Naivasha Basin in Kenya. And over the years, there has been the flower farms have been located there, and they're dependent on good quality fresh water. And over the years, there have also been concern about the quality of the fresh water and also the volumes as well. And these flower farms, they withdraw water and for their operations. And then they produce the flowers. The trucks go to in the evening. They go to the airport, and then Nairobi airport, and then in the next morning it arrives here in the Netherlands or in the UK in the plane. Fresh flowers. Now, of course, if you deal with problems to this basin, this Naivasha Lake Naivasha, and if there is scarcity of water, which was at some point thought to be a problem due to various reasons, then companies need to save water, and they've introduced new techniques, drip irrigation, and so on. And some of these companies, some of the 30 companies, have indeed halved their water intake. But actually, and including Dutch researchers and others, have looked at this issue. And actually, you need to look at it in a much wider context. You can't only think about this context, but you need to look at other uses of land around Lake Naivasha. And then you go, so you've got an energy producer close by that requires some water, although not much, but it's geothermal research. It's of course based on heat from the land, but it also needs water for the steam and so on. To create the steam, and including to power the flower farms. But actually, if you look at what goes into the Lake Naivasha, so it's the river there, upstream river, that's where some of the major effects happen. So basically, the upstream farmers, they've been changing the land use, and because of the changing land use, there has been going much deforestation and so on. There has been more deforestation, and that has led to less water going into the river, into Lake Naivasha, and that has been compromising a bit the quality and the quantity of water going into the lake. And actually, what then is a possible solution to the problem, in addition to thinking about efficiencies here. So thinking about efficiency here is actually to say, well, we need to change land patterns land use patterns upstream. And one way to do that is actually to pay the farmers upstream to do different things. And indeed, flower companies have come together in a cooperation to just do that. So that's an innovative way of looking at it, and you need to be thinking much more wider than just the water resource. You also think about land use upstream. Another example, you have the Limpopo River, so there's used for agriculture. The farmers use water, everywhere. And then, because of various reasons, including scarcity or the perception of scarcity and food security in emerging markets and in elsewhere, companies need to go to other countries to buy up or use land in poorer countries, including around the Limpopo River, to use that land. So there's of course land available and so on, and they use that land maybe for biofuel production or for something else. And from a land perspective, of course, there are lots of things that need to be worked out. What is a good land deal and so on, and have a good land policy in place. But what may not occur to many of the people looking at the land policy is actually that, and if you have a number of these deals, is that they have effect on water withdrawals, and if you add it up, maybe the total annual water withdrawal from the river might still be possible. It might be not too bad, and downstream farms could still use their water. But if you take into account some seasonal variation, then there might be some peak demand where these upstream users and the big companies use all of the water, and downstream users have very little water. So therefore, it's very important to take into account the effects that what some call land grabs, land investment, have on water use, because that then has any implications for land users downstream. Again, think about the well nexus. A third example, think about sort of small-scale farming. There are lots of them in smallholders in African countries, and they support their livelihoods. They may not be the most productive, but they require few energy resources and have little effects on nitrogen use. Then bring in large-scale commercial agriculture, and that has, of course, brings lots of resources, very productive, but it also needs inputs such as energy and has effects on nitrogen, which then has an effect on water use as well. So then you can't only be thinking about the bag of money you get from it, but you also have to be thinking about what actually are you doing to the rest of the resources. And so you need to think about sustainable agriculture. I'm not saying whether one system is better than the other, and so the previous system, of course, is not so productive. This system is very intensive in its natural resources use and the effect it has on natural resources. But in both ways, one needs to be more productive and the other needs to be more sustainable. But you need to be taking into account the well nexus. So if you think about managing the well nexus to respond to these challenges on the resources, you take into account the effects that one solution has on the other resources. So if you think about energy policy, you take into account what effect it has on water and land, and so on. If you develop a land policy to deal with land grabs, make sure that you take into account land grabs have on water, and so on. And what this teaches us up front is that we can't just maximize one problem and then move to the next problem, then maximize that solution to that problem, and then go to the next one. You actually now need to optimize across a range of problems, and that is a different way of looking at things. So the traditional neoclassical way of looking at things was you first solve this problem, most efficient way there, and then you go to the next problem. But if resources are running out, or if you run into big problems in the next resource because you have dealt with one problem, then that's not the most efficient way of looking at it. So you need to optimize across a range, optimize range the nexus. And in the report, we are looking at, and we have got a draft there, so you can take a copy there. As we look at sort of three type of actions, so the public governance challenge, there's a corporate governance challenge, and a global governance challenge. And of course, they are interrelated. And then the question, of course, in the last one is, what can the EU do, and how can it help developing countries? We think about sort of a schematic overview in each of the case study chapters, the case study chapters on water, energy, and land. We think about how the challenges, the increased scarcities, whether it's economic or physical scarcity, manifest themselves in each of the resources. and we then think about what are the issues that need to be addressed, and we think about how the public and private sector have addressed these issues. And we look at three issues, and just to run over them, so we'll be thinking about how to tackle water allocation and access issues. So in water resource, of course, we need to take into account that in some countries there's physical scarcity, parts of northern China, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, India, parts of India. But in other countries there's quite a lot of water, but there's not access to it, so it needs to be developed. And in yet other countries there's too much water, so flooding and so on. So these are different problems. And the energy problem, we focus particularly on renewable energy and think about how renewable energy can solve the problem of increased pressures on our carbon space. And there are opportunities out there. So renewable energies can also provide energy for the poorest people, and also so helps a social or inclusive growth. It helps economic growth, as it were, and of course it then might help deal with the carbon space issue. But I think there are also challenges, so that almost any renewable energy source has implications for water and land. And in terms of land, we're looking into how to solve increased pressures on land. And the increased pressures manifest themselves in different ways, but one way that we've been seeing in the last few years is the increased land deals, so that companies, sovereign wealth funds and so on are buying up or leasing land in poor countries that have land. Now we then look at solutions. We look at solutions in the public sector, and then I move on to the private sector. In particular, we say, well, if there is increased pressures on the resource, then there are these four ways of looking at that and dealing with it. First of all, you can manage demand. So if the problem is that there's too much demand, there's too much pressure on water in a particular area or globally, then you need to make sure that you manage that. For instance, by getting prices right. I mean, the price, the cost of withdrawing water, the environmental cost of withdrawing water is unlikely to have been included in the price of water, and getting that right, for instance, is an important step. And of course, there is as well think about fossil fuel subsidies that need to be thought about. The second way of dealing with the problem is expand and diversify supply. So of course, think about if there's a problem with scarcity, then maybe find some new. If there are pressures on land, maybe then find more land. But of course, there are limits to it, and also there are limits to supply options generally, because they might create problems on other resources, as I explained before. But then, of course, the third way of looking at it is to promote efficiencies. Allocative efficiency. If you're more efficient in dealing with the resource, then the problems of scarcity will be diminished. That will be divided into three types of efficiencies: productive, allocative, and nexus-wide efficiencies. And finally, if we deal with the problem through pricing, for instance, so that prices are right and they reflect the environmental cost, then of course there will be gainers and losers. And some of the losers some of the gainers might be the poorest, but it might also be the poorest might also be amongst the losers as well. And therefore, we need to think about how to protect the poorest from these changes. We then look at roles for the public sector and synthesize it across the sectors and so on, and really look at sort of five roles: coordination, facilitation, rules and regulation, providing public goods and investment, and protecting the poorest. And there, what we actually find is that although we know how to deal with the problem, there are very often political economic constraints that tell us that actually these ideal solutions may not happen, or they're not happening in practice. There's too much pressure. So, for instance, getting the prices right, removing fuel subsidies. Well, you may know better than I do, but if you go to India, where of course the Green Revolution has been built on subsidies, energy subsidies, removing those it's going to be very difficult for obvious reasons. And that's with a number of these issues. It's if we say, well, deal not only with one resource at a time, deal with the nexus of the resources. If that means that you need to coordinate users of all these resources, then the land users, water users, energy users, and producers. And if you then need to coordinate that, that's very difficult, and it's also expensive, but it's also very difficult, and it's not that easy to do. It needs interministerial coordination and so on. So there are political economy limits to what can be done. And then what we then look at is then, well, what then can be done? We know that we need to transform an economy from business as usual growth, which would mean transgressing the planetary boundaries, towards a new type of growth, inclusive and sustainable growth, and that needs a transformation of the economy, and that needs help from public, private, and all the actors. And we need to be ambitious, but there are these political economy constraints. So we then look at some of the issues, some of the steps that can be done. So policy development, new targets need to be set, and so on. Pricing, how to use particular specific opportunities for subsidy reform and so on. And making regulation more business friendly to empower business, for instance, to start up renewable energy businesses more easily. And then in terms of the roles of the private sector, we find sort of across the sectors, and also in our background papers, and by the way, all these issues that I talk about come from background papers, from discussions with business as well, is that private sector is increasingly investing in water, renewable energy, and land, and there are opportunities out there. So the scarcity also brings new opportunities, and this includes some triple wins, there are examples that I come back to that in a minute, but one obvious example is that there are opportunities for certain private companies to start solar power, to provide solar power services to the poorest. So the poorest do get access to energy, and it's in a clean way, and the company makes money. Now that's a triple win, and I think those are the sort of solutions that need to be thought about. We do a lot on, and the chapter's been written. There are about 10 chapters in the report written by various experts, experts on water, on land, on energy. But we also have some experts who run a business program in ODI, for instance, who look at sustainability issues in business and look at the drivers of that, and they identify a number of drivers for becoming more sustainable, including cost efficiency, securing access to supply of inputs, license to operate, and market access. Although you can work on those drivers, quite clearly some companies are doing better than others, and that's something that we call the corporate governance gap. And then the question, of course, is why is that the case? Why is it that even though the incentives might be similar, even within the sector, that some companies do better than others? Some look much more take the global context much more into account than others. And finally, the chapter then discusses also some issues for how donors could help. And very often there's been little interaction between sort of donors and business, but the question, of course, is what donors can do. Now, if you look at sort of the Rio +20 conference, so the Rio conference came up with the concept or discussed sustainable development. The concept was started before. Then 10 years later in Johannesburg, there was an innovation in dealing with the issues, thinking about so-called Type 2 partnerships, and some of these partnerships were led by business. So I think about partnership between business and civil society and governments. But actually, we know preciously little about the effect of these, and I think that's something that also the previous presentation alluded to. So actually, we need to know much more about what type of partnerships have actually worked? How can donors actually best engage with business to improve sustainability? Just to 2 or 3 slides to finish off with. We've had presentations by companies during our consultations, and also have had background papers looking at some of the issues. And there were some very interesting examples of how businesses are solving some of the pressures that are coming onto the resources. Of course, one example, which you may know better than I do, coming from the business school tradition, is the example of Coca-Cola, which burnt itself years ago because it was withdrawing too much water from the community, and it's now put in place a policy that suggests that, at least globally, we're not going to operate without having a neutral impact on our water withdrawals. And of course, that's a very different way of operating. If water sustainability comes at the top of your business model, then of course it's not just a corporate social responsibility, but it actually you include it into your core competencies of your model. And that's of course is exactly what we will be looking at when we're thinking about the role of business. Shell has been looking at some of the issues, also brings new technology to the biofuel industry, and it recycles 90% of the water used. Now, of course, then if you save 90% of the water, that is of course very, very helpful, because in other countries, if you have still the first generation biofuels, or then the production of those biofuels might create pressures on water withdrawals that are unsustainable. And I already mentioned about the flower companies thinking about solutions there. I've also mentioned some of the solutions for the energy sector, so the solar power industry, and maybe also to come back to this Lake Navasha example. Actually, some of the flower companies themselves have dug holes and are withdrawing heat from the earth, so geothermal heat. And they've invested money in that, but it pays back, so it's very good for production of the flowers. And you can produce flowers, apparently, according to some researchers, that now uses 1/10 of the carbon dioxide emissions, or produces now 1/10 of the carbon dioxide emissions than flowers produced here in the greenhouses here in Holland. We've also had an interesting discussion in Kenya, in a consultation in Kenya, where Unilever Kenya is thinking about promoting sustainable agriculture throughout the value chain. So how can it help its suppliers to become more sustainable? The businesses are looking increasingly at resource scarcity issues, and only recently I was at a Shell discussion in Rotterdam, gathering a number of people thinking about how to deal with the resource nexus. And they define it slightly differently, but it's food security, water security, and energy security. And then they brainstormed a lot of issues that went into it, and then they found a number of nodes that were very important in solving the issues. So, of course, if something relates to something else, you've got problems because you've got externalities, and one problem creates another. But conversely, if you can find the key solutions and tackle that particular solution, you can solve more than one problem. And that's then, of course, the idea behind this sort of network analysis that Shell was initiating. Finally, I mean, you can think about a lot of individual examples, actually, where businesses are doing a lot, and you may know more, and this conference may well come up with a lot more of solutions to some of the challenges that we mentioned in the beginning. But for instance, Cargill has been engaged in sort of a number of other companies in thinking about moving away from a traditional sort of CSR code of conduct approach, so vertical approach, towards saying, actually, hang on, we depended on a particular ecosystem, land in Indonesia, and there are other users of that land as well, and we can't simply look at our bit and make that socially responsible and sustainable. We actually need to be looking at what the whole ecosystem is doing, and we need to be taking a different approach. A different approach needs to be taken that manages the ecosystem rather than only the value chain. And there are other companies that look at the well nexus. Finally, you've got a number of implications for the EU, EU member states, and the Commission, and these deal with basically the EU itself can solve the problem, or can be part of the solution. If in the beginning I said that the demand for water is increasing by 40%, and of course the amount of water is finite, you only have so much water, then actually if you reduce waste, reduce food waste, then you can deal with some of those challenges, because food requires water and other inputs as well. So if you if you change wastage in the value chain through demand side management and so on, you can almost do away with all the challenges that I mentioned. But of course, there are other issues that it can look at, and I won't mention them in detail. But it has trade and investment policies. I mean, the EU is a very big trading partner for developing countries, so it can help in that way. And of course, it's a larger donor. It's larger than other. I think the World Bank, and it's larger than the UN systems. It's a larger donor around as well. So the Commission itself is the larger donor, and it can help developing countries manage their natural resources as well, and it can push for global solutions. So basically, what I was saying is that there are global challenges out there, and these global environmental challenges compromise development, particularly have effects on the poorest if nothing has happened, is acted upon. You're saying that business as usual isn't possible because that has impacts on the poorest. We need to transform the economy to create a different type of growth, which we call inclusive and sustainable growth. And that requires actions by the public and the private sector, and also nationally and globally. We have mentioned a number of those solutions. Finally, on the process, we've already had a number of consultations, and we've got a group of sort of 10 people writing the report, but we haven't finished yet. We're at the emerging findings stage yet. So if you have any suggestions of things, and of course the discussion later we might bring up some other issues, then we're very welcome to hear your views during maybe the coming consultations next week. We hold another consultation in Bonn on the sort of the Nexus conference, and maybe in other issues. But you can also send me an email. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity. Thank you.